All right, good morning. Good to see everybody here. So we're going to continue, and this is our last Sunday where we'll be in the book of Psalms, and we'll be in one of the most popular, if not the most popular psalm this morning, Psalm 23. So if you want to turn there, you can follow along in Psalm 23. But we've been following kind of this theme of relationship with God. And in the midst of going through the New Testament and learning so much about Christ and learning so much about various aspects of who he is and how we relate to him and how we live before him, I wanted to kind of just take a moment, take a deep breath, take a month, if you will, and just remind ourselves of what it's all about, boiling down our spiritual life really to its most basic elements. And so we've been focusing on our relationship with God. And in Psalm 139, we found that our relationship with God is better than any relationship we have on earth. Better than the relationship we have with our parents, with our children, our spouse, our friends, our co-workers. Whatever relationship you throw out there, our relationship with God is far superior to those relationships. And, he has immense knowledge of us. He's very near to us in a way that other people cannot be. He's also has a history with us that other people don't have. And he's also he's always thinking about us, and his thoughts towards us are continual. So where other people might think about us every once in a while, he's continually thinking about us. And so because of those reasons and more, our relationship with God is precious, it's wonderful, and something worth seeking after. But then we looked at Psalm 73, where Asaph had a challenge of faith. He began to question the justice of God as he saw the belligerent, the wealthy, the evil prospering and doing well, while the righteous are having a rough go at life, and even more rough than the average person. And he was challenged by that, but he worked through those difficulties and came out with an even more solid relationship with God. We talked about the importance of wrestling with our doubts, dealing with them, working through those, and how that can actually deepen our relationship with God. And then we looked at Psalm 51, where David had committed a grievous sin by committing adultery with Bathsheba. And he tried to cover it up by having her husband Uriah killed in battle. And Nathan brings out his sin, that is David's sin, and David responds in Psalm 51 with this song, or this psalm of lament over sins. And we saw how we can properly respond to and deal with sin in our own lives, in both the effects of sins, but also the remedy of sins. So we investigated that. So we dealt with basically two things that kind of interrupt our relationship with God. If we have doubts about him, we're not going to fully embrace our relationship. If we're sinning against him, obviously, there's going to be a break in the relationship. At least relationally. But now today we're going to bring it all to a head. We're going to really dive into this relationship with God and what we can expect as we walk in a deep, abiding, strong relationship with God. And there's wonderful blessings that come in walking before the Lord and seeking him and desiring him each and every day. And so we're going to use Psalm 23 to talk about just how wonderful our relationship with God is and what we can expect from that relationship. And then we're going to take some brief moments at the end to kind of tie it all together and actually look at some practical things we can do to cultivate, strengthen, embark on this relationship with God. So that's what we can look ahead to as we move into this lesson. So as mentioned, we're going to get into Psalm 23. And your Bible probably has a little title at the beginning saying, A Psalm of David. And of course, he's the one that is... this psalm is attributed to, and he's going to be talking about God in terms of a shepherd. And as you know, David himself was a shepherd. He was a shepherd. He was out tending the flock actually when Samuel came to anoint him as king. And he had ran into bears and lions while he was shepherding the sheep. He had basically experience in what it means to be a shepherd, and he's using that experience to relate that to his relationship with God. And so let's just read the psalm, and as we did previous weeks, and we'll just read the psalm, get the whole gist of it, and then we'll go back and look at it in more detail. Psalm 23, starting in verse 1. says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me, and your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So here you can just see, he's just laying it out in these short, concise statements. He's just laying out, this is what the Lord as my shepherd means for me. And we'll go and look at it one by one. But as we think about it, it is significant that he does talk about the Lord as a shepherd in verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd. There's a special relationship there. And maybe sometimes we think of God purely in terms of the sovereign one, the king, creator of the universe, high above us, sits in heaven, earth is his footstool, and his sovereignty, his majesty, his greatness, his grandeur, all of that. Maybe that's the picture that we have of God, and that's an appropriate picture. That's an accurate picture of God. That's who he is. But there should also be a sense in which we see God as our shepherd, because a shepherd doesn't just rule over the sheep and tell the sheep what to do and then kind of goes about his business. He's very attentive to the sheep. He cares for the sheep. He provides for the sheep. He loves the sheep. And as Jesus would say later on in John chapter 10, if he's a really good shepherd, he lays down his life for the sheep. And so this way of looking at his relationship with God, with David, is to say, the way that I relate with these sheep, that either he was presently tending to or as he's reflecting back when he was a shepherd, just as I would relate to those sheep, that's how God relates to me. And he seems to be focusing on the aspect of shepherdhood by supply, in the sense that God gives him his full supply. And that brings us to that next statement, I shall not want. So he's my shepherd, and because he's my shepherd, I shall not want. I don't lack anything. He is my full supply. And if you think about it, that's kind of the relationship between a shepherd and a sheep. The sheep can look to the shepherd for everything that he or she needs. They can look to the shepherd for food, for watering, for protection. And we'll see some of those aspects in the psalm. But for everything that sheep needs, they can look to the shepherd as the full supply. And this ought to be one of the most precious statements in Psalm 23. Because this is not what we've been taught. This is not the narrative the world has given us. The world has bombarded us with the message that you need this, and you need that, and you need to do this, and you need to be involved in that, and you got to be chasing after this, and you got to have the perfect life, and you've got to have a big house, and you've got to have these cars, and you've got to have 2.5 children, and you've got to, have this career and have this education, and they constantly are bombarding us, and even with advertisements on the internet, you can't even be reading anything without some type of advertisement popping up in your face telling you need something. And constantly we're being told that what you have is not enough, that you need more. You need this, you need that, you need that. How refreshing is it to know that because God is our shepherd, we'll not want. There's nothing that we need besides God. And he'll explain why that's the case in a moment. But isn't it nice to know? I may not have a highfalutin career. I may not have the best education. I may not be the richest person on my street. I may not be the one that everyone looks up to as far as knowledge or influence or anything like that. But if I have God, and if I have the relationship with God, I have everything that I need. Think about what we have in our relationship with God. We have a relationship with the creator of everything. Everything belongs to him. Cattle on 1,000 hills belong to our God. And he created it all. He is powerful. Going back to what we talked about earlier. He is sovereign. He is majestic. He is all those things. He is high above us, and he is powerful and mighty and great. And in him is the full supply of life. And there's nothing that was created that wasn't created by our Heavenly Father. And that's the one we have a relationship with. That's the one we walk with, talk with, have friendship with throughout our days. What do you need more than that? Can Amazon supply you anything more than that? Can Walmart, does it have a shelf that says, oh, yeah, you have God, but you also need this? No. Martha knows what I'm talking about. So, no, we don't need anything else besides God. We are fully supplied in him. If you have God, just relax your shoulders, quiet your soul, you're fully supplied. That's what David saw. A man who probably went from a state of not having as much to becoming king, who knew what it was like to both be just a shepherd tending some sheep to tending a whole nation and having nations pouring in the wealth to him and having great things. It didn't matter to him because God was his full supply. Even within the first 3 verses here, you can see how he was fully supplied physically, mentally, and spiritually. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, we're told that if you want to really break down who we are as a whole, it really breaks down to our spirit, soul, and body. May your spirit, soul, and body be found blameless at the coming of the Lord. We are basically made of 3 parts. We have a body, a physical body that we interact with the world with, and this earth is how we see, hear, touch, taste, smell. We have a physical body, but we also have a soul. And here, the word soul relates to the mental facilities. It is where our emotion is, where our will is, where our thinking, our intellect is in our minds, in our soul. But then we also have a spirit. And that's how we relate to God. We communicate to God. God is spirit. Therefore, those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. It's through our spirit that we communicate to him. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, we're told that we're one spirit with Christ. And so there's a deep bond that takes place between the believer and God, spirit to spirit. And so we have a body, a mind, and a spirit. And he relates to all 3 of these. He says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. So a sheep, that was a physical thing. He could go to the grass and eat and be supplied. He could go to the water and drink and be physically taken care of. Mentally, he restores my soul. My mind is refreshed because of him. And then spiritually, he guides me in the paths of righteousness. So David would see him as one who supplies for him physically, mentally, and spiritually. But there's even more deeper things going on here as well. And we'll look at those as we move through. But the main thing here is that in every aspect of life, God was his full supply. And that led to verse 2. He makes me lie down in green pastures. The idea of rest. As I talked about before, you can just rest, knowing that you have your full supply in God. I want to give you this mental picture, okay? Maybe you're driving down the road, or maybe you're at a friend's house, you're visiting a friend, and maybe he owns some sheep, and you look out on his pasture, and it doesn't look anything like my pasture. It's full of lush green grass, no weeds or mesquite trees robbing the nutrients or anything like that, just a nice green pasture. And in this pasture, you see a sheep. But the sheep is running around frantically. He's running to this fence, and he's running to that fence, and he's doing circles, and he's leaping around, and he's just frantic, and he's scared, and he doesn't know. It's as though he's searching for something, and he's looking for something to eat, and he doesn't know what to do. How ridiculous would that be? For a sheep, in the midst of a green, lush pasture, to be running around, no pun intended, but like a chicken with the head cut off, just running around looking for something to eat when he has a full supply of grass all around him. And all that's really required of him is just to lay down, rest, and eat, and take it easy. That's what we have with God. Oftentimes we're like that sheep that I just described. We're running to this place and that place, and we're trying to find satisfaction in entertainment, hobbies, careers, education, other relationships and all those things. Not that they're wrong in and of themselves, but those are the things that we're chasing after and living for, trying to find some type of satisfaction, some type of sustenance, and we're just running around like crazy. And all the while we have the lush green pastures of God in our heart and our soul all around us. He is in our midst. We have him dwelling in us and around us. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 tells us he is in our midst, and we have God as our full supply. He is our green pasture in whom we can delight ourselves in, fill ourselves with, and be satisfied by. Too often we're frantically looking for the only thing that God can truly supply. But when we find him as our lush green pasture, we can just rest. And we're not running, we're not even standing. We're just laying and resting, knowing that he has everything that we need. Which leads to the next thing, God's peace. He leads me beside quiet waters. It's very important that he put quiet waters. I believe the King James says still waters. It's very important that he put that because waters sometimes can be very chaotic. You ever been caught in a storm where rain is just flying everywhere? Or maybe you've been to an overflowing river that's just gushing forth and trampling over everything in its path. Water can be very chaotic and very destructive, but here he describes it as quiet waters or still waters, which gives you the picture of peace. Yes, supply in that he can quench his thirst, but also the fact that he can receive of that water in a very peaceful way. No fear of being taken away by the river, no fear of being taken over by the storm. He can just drink the supply. When we realize that God is our supply, and we rest in the fact that he is the one that supplies us with all that we need, it leads to peace. And I think that's what we're all chasing after in our lives, is just peace. There's something within us that avoids chaos, that wants peace in our lives. This is why we tame the wilderness. That's why when people go into the wilderness, they want to overcome the wilderness, to tame the wilderness, and to bring peace into the wilderness. Our God, and I think that's a reflection of our God who brings peace out of chaos. That's what he did in creation. The world was in darkness and waters were covering the surface of the deep, but God sent his Spirit to just hover over it, and out of it came order. Out of the chaos. He was able to do that, and he does that in our lives as well. Jesus promised us peace in John chapter 14, and then also in chapter 16 as well. And he says, my peace I leave with you, not as the world gives you, do I give you, but I want to leave you his peace. So he himself had peace in himself. As he lived on this earth, as he had the troubles and the trials that he went through, there was just a peace that he had, a composure that he held. Not that he was ever troubled in spirit. There was times he wept. There was times that he said, my spirit is troubled. But underneath it all, there was this calmness, this peace, this assurance that he had from the Father. And he said that I leave that peace with you. I give that peace to you. That's a gift to us from Jesus. And then he says in verse 16, he says in verse 33, these things I have spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. So it doesn't say that we're going to have peace in the world. Obviously not. He himself was about to go to the cross. His disciples would be persecuted. Many of them would be martyred. They would have very much tribulation in the world, but just to have that inward peace that he would supply. And it seems to be connected to the words that he shared with them, the promises that he gave. But there's just this peace. And in God, we have abundant peace in him. And a lot of that, again, stems from the fact that he's all that we need. And then in verse 3, he restores my soul. We get to the point where we see God as our refreshment. He restores my soul. He refreshes my mind. He just helps me to be refreshed. yesterday I was mowing on our property, and for those who don't know, we have a pretty big part that we mow. We mow at least 3 acres, and it takes several hours to mow. And I didn't take water with me. I just went out there and mowed, wanted to knock it out. And by the time I was done, I knew I was thirsty, but boy, I really knew how thirsty I was when I went back into the house and I began to drink water, and I began to drink more water and more water and more water. As soon as I got that taste of water, I realized just how thirsty I was, and I just began to drink and drink and drink it up. Unfortunately, a lot of times in our spiritual life, we're like that. We go a long time without refreshing ourselves in the Lord, and as time goes by, we become spiritually dehydrated, our hearts become dry, and we just begin to feel as though we feel really the vanity of life, and things become just really arduous and difficult. But then we remind ourselves, oh yeah, God. And we go back to God and we drink Him, and we realize just how refreshing it is to just delight ourselves in Him and to give our lives over to Him once again, and to set our minds and center our hearts on Him once again. And all of a sudden we realize, yes, this is where the refreshing comes from. And then that causes us to want to drink more and more. But unfortunately, we go a long time before we reach that point. How much better it would have been if while I was mowing, I had a cup of water next to me. I could just drink as I was going along. As I was experiencing the dryness of the air, the dust that was flying up, the caliche that was flying in my face, I could have just grabbed that cup and been refreshed. That's really what we need from the Lord, and how we can relate to the Lord in our lives. Not waiting until we're completely empty within and completely without resources and completely down and out, but all the time just drinking of the Lord, drinking of the goodness of the Lord, delighting ourselves in the Lord, loving the Lord, stretching out our hearts to the Lord, seeking the Lord. We just find a constant refreshing over and over again. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the practical part of this lesson. But just keep that in mind. God is our refreshing, our refreshment. It says He guides me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And so we have God's guidance in our lives. Just as a shepherd would guide the sheep. I've never owned sheep, but I've heard that sheep do have a tendency to stray. And as a matter of fact, if you don't keep an eye on them, they'll just walk off of a cliff. And so the shepherd always has to keep his eye on the sheep. He's always got to keep them wrangled and contained, or they might injure themselves. The same thing is true with us. That's why we need to rely on God for our true guidance in life. And He'll guide us into righteousness. And that I think it's appropriate that this is placed in the place that it is in this psalm, because as we find God as our full supply, as we find Him as our rest, our peace, our refreshment, our response to that ought to be, Lord, I want to then respond to You in righteousness, a righteous life before You, to live before You in a way that's right, to hunger and thirst after righteousness, to quote Jesus in Matthew chapter 6. And what we find in the psalm is that even in that, if you have a desire to be righteous, God will guide you into righteousness. As you surrender to Him, as you submit to Him, as you give yourself as an offering to Him, He will grant you the wisdom to know how to walk before Him through His Word, through circumstances, in a lot of different ways. James chapter 1 says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally and without reproach. That's a promise from God. I will give you wisdom if we seek after Him, if we realize that His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, His ways are higher than our ways. He will guide us. And the psalmist saw that in his relationship with God. And so we have full supply, verses 1 through 3. We have God's full supply. And when we have God's full supply, that gives us the rest that we need, the peace that we need, the refreshment that we need, and the righteousness that we desire. But what happens when things go wrong? What happens when, okay, we have this picture of a sunshiny day, sheep at the pasture with the still waters, and it's all great, they're fully supplied. But what happens when the darkness comes? What happens when we're not led on the mountaintops, but we're also led down into the valley of darkness and even possible death? Does God's relationship with us still stand? Does it still remain pertinent to us? Well, David's going to tell us in verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, even if my circumstances change, Even if life gets bleak and harsh and difficult, I fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So here when he talks about the valley of the shadow of death, he's not just talking about a person who might get a diagnosis from the doctor that they're about to die. It could include that. But this is kind of like a metaphor. It's a figure of speech. Just saying, even the hardest of times. Back then, and this is in the book of Job as well. When they talk about death, that was like the darkest of the dark. That was the way it described as dark as you can get is death. And so when he talks about the valley of the shadow of death, he's talking about the deep, deep, dark places of life. Even though I get into those deep, dark places where everything seems chaotic and out of control, I'll fear no evil. Why? Because of the presence of God. And this is one of the most wonderful things that we have. Yes, we have a relationship with God, but it's not a long-distance relationship. It's not that I pray and I have to dial a long distance. I know you don't really have to do that anymore, but I remember a time when you had to dial in long distance. Anyways, we don't have to call long distance to him because he is very near to us. His presence is there with us. When we're going through those dark places, there may be no light in our circumstances. And in our situation, there may be no brightness. It may be all dark and bleak. And we need to be real about that. You go through the book of Psalms, and the psalmist is very vivid in what they were going through and the difficulties that they were having. Being honest about our circumstances, but at the same time realizing that there's a light in the darkness. To where we say, instead of saying, well, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, sometimes we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we can see the light within the tunnel. And that light is the presence of God. And so when we go into the darkness, we have the light of God's presence to get us through and give us a good passage through. Psalm 16 says, in the presence of the Lord is fullness of joy. Just walking in the presence of God in and of itself brings joy to our hearts and can help us in those dark times. But here he said, I don't even fear that because I know God's going to be with me. A lot of our fear, a lot of our anxiety, a lot of the strain on our hearts and our minds are usually about things in the future. But what if this goes wrong? What if this happens to my kids? What if my kids don't grow up and go this path? And constantly we're thinking about the future. Maybe you have some things even this week that are weighing on your heart. You're thinking about them, and maybe you're considering, what you might be having to experience in the upcoming week with coworkers or whoever else, and that really weighs on you. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Remember, God's with you. You're not going into it alone. Oftentimes what we fear doesn't even come into reality. Fear oftentimes is something where we make up difficulties, future difficulties that don't even take place. But even if they do take place, even though I do have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't have to fear. I can go with my head held up high, my chest out, and I can boldly walk into the darkness because he's with me. Think about a kid who, I don't know if you were afraid of the dark when you were a kid. I was for a little short period of time. And whenever a kid's afraid of the dark, usually it's at the time of bedtime. They go to bed, you turn off the light, and they become afraid because they're in the darkness. They don't like being in the darkness. What does a kid usually desire when they're in the darkness? Well, the obvious answer is to turn on the light. But what else would help them while they're afraid in the darkness? For the presence of their parents to come in. And when the presence of the parents come in, the fear is alleviated. Same thing is true with us. We're kids. Let's face it. Spiritually, we're kids. And we're afraid of the dark. We're afraid to go into those dark places. We don't want to be where it's dark. We don't want to go in a place where we lose control of the situation and we can't see where we're going and everything seems chaotic. We try to avoid that as much as possible. But you know what will alleviate our fear? Our fear of the dark? just having the presence of our Father with us, holding our hand all the way, comforting us, keeping us secure in his arms. That's where we find security, and that's where we can find peace and rest, even in the times of darkness and hardship. And then we get to God's blessings in verse 5. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. You prepare a table before me. The idea of, again, full supply. But it's done in the presence of his enemies. David was always concerned about what his enemies were thinking about whenever he was entering into hardship. He would say things like, don't let my enemies triumph over me. Don't let my enemies, or he'd be thinking of times when his enemies would say, where is God that you trust? A lot of concern of what his enemies were thinking were usually in his relationship with God. Like, how is this going to reflect on God, what I'm going through? But here he's saying that even in the presence of my enemies, they're going to see me, they're going to look at me, and even though I'm going through difficulties sometimes, when they see me, what are they going to see? A table spread out with full supply. A wonderful, just abundance of sustenance and food and satisfaction there in the presence of God. Is that what our enemies see when we enter hardship? Is that what people see in our lives? I think if we trace back and we really take seriously what David has talked about here, they will see that. When we're walking through our lives and we say, hey, I don't need anything else but God. Yeah, I might go for an education. Yeah, I might try to get a good career. There might be some things that I'm doing, but really at the end of the day, I have God, and that's really ultimately all that I need. I have peace, I have rest, I have refreshment. I can even walk a righteous life before him. I'm just living the good life. Not because I have material possessions or anything like that. It's just because I have this inner peace. When people see you living like that and you really take that seriously and you're really seeking your relationship with God in that way and these things are coming out, what are they going to see? They're going to see a man or a woman with a table spread out before them with full supply. That's what you see. That's what they'll see when they look at us in our relationship with God. You have anointed my head with oil, the idea of consecration, and my cup overflows. So pouring out and an overflowing is the idea here. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup just overflows. The idea of overflowing means that I have what I need. Yeah, I have God as my full supply, but he gives me more than I need. And the idea of John chapter 7, it talks about, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me, Jesus said. And he said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. He said, I'm not just going to give you a cup of water to drink so you won't be thirsty, but you're going to have this water just gushing forth out of your heart. And other people are going to be affected by that. And so you're not only going to have enough so that you'll be refreshed, so that you'll be supplied, but there'll be an overflow where you can guide other people and be a refreshment to other people. When we're thirsty, when we're dry, when we're empty, we're usually trying to get everybody else to give us something to fill it up. But when we just have our full supply in God, we have enough to overflow to where we can help other people and guide them into having more sustenance and fullness of life. And he says in verse 6, surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days, no matter where I go. Goodness and loving kindness will follow me. Not just today, not just on Sunday morning when we have our Bibles open and we're reading the Word. All the days of my life. I'll just have what I need. Goodness and love will be with me, and no one will be able to take that away from me. Paul speaks about this in Romans chapter 8, where he does, let's face it, the scriptures are very open about the difficulty that righteous people face. But we still have the loving kindness of God following us everywhere that we go. In verse 35 of Romans 8, he says, who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Just as it is written, For your sake we are being put to death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. But in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. Loving kindness follows us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Goodness and loving kindness will follow us everywhere that we go, even in the valley of the shadow of death. Goodness and loving kindness will follow us all the days of our life. Every day you wake up in God's love. Every day you wake up, you experience the goodness of God. And there's nowhere you can go on this earth, nowhere you can travel, where you will not meet the goodness and love of God. The only thing we got to do is open up our hearts to see it and not turn a blind eye. His love is there. His goodness is there. We just have to take it in and receive it. He says, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's the wonderful thing about walking in the presence of God. Forever. 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 A wonderful word in a world where everything is temporary, where everything is cut short, where even the greatest and the highest joys and pleasures we experience at some point come to an end. With him, it's forevermore. Forever and ever, and it never stops. It follows us from this day through tomorrow, through our work week, through the weekend, through the next week, even through death, even unto eternity. Through the resurrection, through the new heavens and the new earth, just continually, absolutely, forever, eternally, we will experience the presence of God. And again, this goes back to why his relationship is so important. So that's the first part of our lesson, and it's just basically focusing on what we can experience or expect with our relationship with God. We know that through him, we have a shepherd. We have a full supply. We have rest. We have peace. We have refreshment. We have guidance. We are led into righteousness before him. We can even go through the dark times, and his presence is with us. We have blessings abundant that all can see, and we get to have this experience eternally before him. But there's one last thing we got to consider. And then we'll close out not only this lesson, but this whole month of lessons that we've had. And that is, how do we have a relationship with God? Okay, Joey, you've brought out some Psalms. You talked about it's the most important relationship. You talked about some things that will inhibit that relationship with doubts and sin. And you've even talked about the blessings that come out of that, as we talked about today. But what good does that do me if I don't know how to relate to God, how to draw close to him? And it's very simple. And this won't take long to go through because it is very simple. And I intended it to be simple so that you don't... I could have made a whole lesson out of it, but I want this to be drilled into our heads and to be something that we can pull to the forefront of our minds readily. And it basically boils down to 3 principles. The principle of one thing, the principle of all day, the principle of every day. That is one thing all day, every day. That's it. That's all you got to do. Okay, so Psalm 27 talks about the one thing. The one thing. In verse 4 of Psalm 27, by the way, all of these are going to be drawn from the Psalms just to keep with our study. But in Psalms 27 and verse 4, it says, one thing I have asked from the Lord, that I shall seek. Money, wealth, possessions, houses? No. That I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to meditate in his temple. To dwell in the house of the Lord. Exodus chapter 25 and verse 8 ties the presence of God with the house of the Lord. He instructed them to build a sanctuary that he may dwell with them. And the idea here is that I only have one desire in life. One thing that I really truly seek. And that is just to dwell in the presence of God. To behold the beauty of the Lord. And to meditate in his temple. Or in his presence, we could say. It starts with just having a single desire. We have a hard time cultivating a relationship with God because of so many distractions, so many desires that come have waves against us and pull us aside and get our minds off of him, that causes us to look the other way from God. But if we wake up every day and with just one thing, one desire in our hearts, then we'll be able to draw close to him. Think about any other relationship you have in this world. Any relationship that you had, your wife, your children, your husband, or your parents. If all you sought was that one relationship, and that's all you truly desired, that would be the starting point to a very fruitful relationship, right? As long as you didn't get possessive and, codependent or anything like that. But just think, you're focused on that one person, saying, you know what, I love you, and in you I'm fully satisfied. You can see how a relationship like that would naturally become stronger. And the same thing is true with God. It starts with us just seeking him. And do whatever you got to do in the morning. All of us are different. All of us have a different way of relating to God in this way. But every morning, wake up, finding some way to just seek after God. And to seek him and center yourself on him. For me, what helps me is what they call deep breathing meditation. Like, just breathe in for 4 seconds and breathe out for 4 seconds. It only takes like 2 or 3 minutes of focusing on your breathing to quiet your mind. And that opens up your mind then to center yourself on God. A lot of times we wake up and we go, okay, I got to do this. I got to drive here. I got to make sure I get to work on time. Get your cup of coffee if you like coffee. Because if you do it without coffee, you might fall back asleep again. But get something or exercise or do something to get you awake. But as soon as you're awake and well awake, just sit in your chair and just breathe in and breathe out. That's the most basic thing. Remember when God created us, what did he do? He breathed into us the breath of life. And if you want to draw close to the Lord, just do some deep breathing and just focus on your breath over and over again until the thoughts that are going like this begin to become less and less, and you're able to just center and focus on one thing and just breathe and breathe. And then that quiets your heart and your mind to then turn your heart to God. Lord, I just seek you. Lord, you are my only desire. And begin speaking words of praise to him. God, you are my full supply. You are my portion forevermore. And maybe even quote scriptures. But then just begin to think about him. But that helps me just to take a few moments to breathe, center myself, and be able to focus on him. But the main thing, and however you do it, is to get to that point where God is all that you desire. That's the first step. And then, second principle is all day. Psalm 71 in verse 8 says, my mouth is filled with your praise and with your glory all day long. So it's not just enough to just wake up in the morning and say, God, you're all that I desire. And then we go into the workplace and all of a sudden we're back distracted by a million things. But all day long, just having our mouth filled with praise. And to say, Lord, every breath that I take is a gift from you. And every time I breathe, I want to breathe out praise. I breathe in, I breathe out praise. I breathe in, I breathe out praise to you. And praising him all day long continually. To make him, that keeps us from beginning to be like a sheep that kind of goes astray. It keeps us centered on him. All day long just praising him. And it doesn't have to be complex prayer. You don't have to, although this might be helpful, memorize long portions of scriptures and quote them. Just short, simple phrases to God all day long. Lord, I love you. Lord, thank you for this day. Lord, thank you for these children. Lord, thank you for these dirty dishes that I'm having to wash right now. Just think. He was like, what? Just thanking him all day long for everything that you're doing and include him in everything that you're doing. This keeps your mind stayed on him all day long. Otherwise, you're going to lose what you gained in the morning and it'll all be lost. And that goes back to the deep breathing as well. Even as you are going through your day, you find yourself distracted, and you don't have to sit down in a chair, just right wherever you are. Take a deep breath, take another deep breath, and just recenter yourself. Go back to praising God. You find yourself distracted, go back to God, praising God. Just do that all day long, and I tell you, there will be joy in your heart like you've never had before. It will overflow in your life because you'll be connected to God, you'll be close to God, and you'll realize that everything that I've been worried about is nothing in comparison to what I have with him. It's a very joyful way of living. But then that brings us to the third principle, And that is every day. So one thing all day, every day. Psalm 145 in verse 2 mentions this. 145 in verse 2. It says, every day I will bless you, and I will praise your name forever and ever. Every day, even to forever. I will praise you, I will bless you. Every day I will bless you, and I will praise your name forever and ever. And the idea behind this is kind of similar to the all-day thing, in that I can't say, well, I went to church on Sunday morning, we worshiped, it was a great experience, we got to read God's word, and it was great, and then expect that to carry you through the week. It's just not going to work. Even if you do what I mentioned earlier, and you center on one thing all day, on Monday you're just focused on the Lord, you're constantly turning your attention back to Him as you're getting distracted, you're turning back to Him all day Monday. If you don't do it on Tuesday, by the time Tuesday's done, all that will be lost. You got to do it every single day. Make a commitment every day. And the more and more you experience the joy and the peace and the comfort that comes from the Lord, the more and more you'll be motivated to keep doing it every single day, because you'll be seeing the great benefits that comes out of it. So, real simple. One thing all day, every day. One thing all day, every day. Just center yourself on God. Remain centered on Him all day long, every day of your life, even to eternity. And you will have a deep, abiding relationship with Him. Now, there's a lot of other things that come along with that. Getting into the Word, learning more about Him. We could have had a long list, but I wanted to keep it simple because that's really what it boils down to. Having Him as your full desire and maintaining Him as your full desire throughout the day and throughout the week, and even for the rest of your life, even into eternity. So that closes our lesson this morning, and it also closes our study in the Psalms. And I am just beside myself excited to get into the book of Luke. So as much as I've enjoyed being in the Psalms, I've been like chomping at the bits because the Gospel of Luke is just wonderful. Half of the book of Luke is unique to Luke. So we're going to be back in the life of Jesus, but we're going to get into a lot of new material. The book of Luke is so deep, it is operating on so many different levels. I think you're going to find it a very interesting study, and hopefully it'll help further your walk with the Lord, your relationship with the Lord. But as for right now, we do call you into a relationship with God and open up the opportunity for you to begin that first step of living a life before God, experiencing Him as your full supply. And one of the first things that you'll experience is salvation and the forgiveness of sins. That's the starting point. And Jesus Christ has made the way for you. Through Jesus Christ, you can have the forgiveness of sins, have your sins washed away, and begin new with the Lord, and begin this wonderful walk. And if you've been straying from the Lord and you want to come back and you need prayers to help you do that, we also offer you this opportunity to do that as well. But whatever your need is, we're here to help you with it.